Today, in this Lenten season of exploring the sacred storied soil in which the Leaven, Salt, and Light community is rooted, we turn our attention to the soil of relational organizing as it has been practiced in this congregation and in this community. Though it might sometimes look like activism or issue-based organizing, the goal of relational organizing is a little different. It's not around a specific issue. The goal of relational organizing is unlocking the power and potential of ordinary people to respond collectively and creatively to the pressures that are affecting their lives. Relational organizing awakens the capacity for leadership and therefore the capacity for transformation in any area. Transformation that might look like the Leaven Land and Housing Coalition and their work, or a collective money move from banks to credit unions, or the unconscious dying or the conscious dying of a congregation in order to give birth to a whole new way of being church. Disorganizing to reorganize. Now, before I invite our storytellers, I'm aware that the language around relational organizing is just loaded with words that get used all the time, but are really rarely defined. And it's also riddled with acronyms to the point of absurdity sometimes. So for the benefit of those of us who are new to the language of organizing, let me just illuminate a few of those words and acronyms that you might hear in the stories for today. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, so the acronyms, I'm just going to go through these real quickly. So IAF, the Industrial Areas Foundation. This is the soil of community organizing in which Leaven, Salt, and Light was rooted, built up by this model, founded in 1940. It's just the longest standing network of local faith and community-based organizations. POP, you might hear this, this acronym, Portland Organizing Project. So this is the local faith-based organizing effort with which Redeemer Lutheran affiliated in 1987. It started in 1985. POP was focused on leadership development and on relationships and story sharing and organizing around pressures within North and Northeast Portland neighborhoods like sewer rates, drug houses, redlining, but it was faith-based. MACG, Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good. So POP folks recognized their limited scope of their power. And so they officially dissolved in 2002 and reorganized. They disorganized to reorganize into a broad-based organization that wasn't just faith-based only. So Leaven, Salt, and Light is currently still an organizational member of MACG. A couple of terms you might hear today, one-to-ones. This is also called lots of different things: relational meetings, individual meetings, intentional conversations, sacred encounters. This is like the fundamental building block of relational organizing because it establishes relationships. And without relationships, without some relational trust, nothing can happen. And story, you hear we use the word story all the time, but it's not just a story, right? This, how we use story in relational organizing is like, it's the life force. It's a person's experience and relationships and woundedness and pressures and gifts and passions, deep interests and essence. So sharing different parts of our stories with others unlocks our life force, but it also unlocks the life force of those who hear it. And it activates this power through which transformation is possible. And then two more, discernment and action. Those are separate, but they're also kind of together. As stories are shared and relationships develop, and connections made, and then the public dimensions of stories are identified, communities can then discern, well, how do we want to act on these pressures? How do we want to turn our stories into power in a public way that can change our situation? Is core team. So a core team is the team of people within whatever organization we're talking about, who are actively and relentlessly engaged in relationship building, in leadership development and discernment and action, and creating a culture in which the practices and the processes of relational organizing are essential to the organization's identity. I hope that that's helpful, just to give a few of those definitions. And those are just my definitions. Those aren't the official definitions, but I think for those of us who are especially new to this kind of language, it's really helpful to have some understanding. So you might hear some of those words in the stories today. So we have three storytellers, Lois Jordahl and John Rodgers and Nancy Phelphs. All have long history and experience with relational organizing, have all been transformed by it in different ways, and they're all going to talk about slightly different aspects of it and how that's been impactful for them. So I'm going to invite Lois to start first. And what would you like to share with us today, Lois? Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Solveig. So most of you know that Levin Community and the Congregation of Salt and Light arose from what we called the nurse log soil of Redeemer Lutheran Church. And last week, those of you who were able to join us heard Kathy Miller talk about some of the stories of her family's founding of Redeemer and the heyday of Redeemer as a church. I also grew up in Redeemer, and a little bit later than Kathy. And in the years after I returned to Portland after college, the decline of mainline churches was becoming really all too real for our congregation. So this story is a piece of the story of how the organization, the institution of Redeemer Lutheran Church, managed to write a new ending or a new next step in our collective story. So a phrase you might have heard around, it wasn't one of the ones that Solveig mentioned, but you can kind of understand it was the practices of organizing. And some of the things that she described are some of the practices of organizing. And one of, if not the main practice, is the one-to-one meeting or the relational meeting, in which, as Solveig said, we share our stories with one another. And we've all probably participated in a one-to-one, whether you know it or not, because it's what we do when we go into the breakout rooms on Zoom. And in the before times, when we were asked to talk with someone in worship. And if you've been around any other churches, you're probably aware that most worship services don't include time to turn to your neighbor or find someone you don't already know and talk with them during the service. Redeemer tried this first quite a long time ago in worship with a simple question about how, when, and why did you come to Portland? And although there was undoubtedly some grumbling to start, it's like, what do you mean we're going to talk to somebody in church during what, there was that. It was amazing how many people said, I learned something new about the person next to me that I've been worshiping with and thought I knew for years. I didn't know their story of how they came to worship. So over time, we did that more and more often, and the community, I would say, became more and more comfortable with doing those one-to-ones, with sharing our stories. We began incorporating them into meetings. We made intentional practice of calling up people and saying, would you like to meet for coffee and have a conversation? We shared each other's values, our passions, the pressures we felt. underlying all this was the pressure the congregation felt around our diminishing numbers and the aging of our population. As Solveig said, I really like the goal, the quote that she mentioned. The goal of relational organizing is unlocking the power and potential of ordinary people to respond together and creatively to the pressures that are affecting our lives. And relational organizing awakens the capacity for transformation. But as you can imagine, transformation is not easy, especially maybe for a congregation. Over a period of several years, Redeemer as a church came to realize that we would need to change to survive. And we didn't know what that change would or should look like. We didn't know where the path we set out on would lead. I don't know the statistics, but I'm sure you can all imagine that many churches or institutions don't really survive attempting to make radical change. And while I can't say that we didn't lose people along the way, I strongly believe that because we had come to know each other in a deeper way, come to know each other's stories through the many relational conversations, we had a foundation of trust in each other that was profound. Even though we didn't know where our process or our leaders would lead us, we knew that we would be listened to, that each person was valued. And because we knew more than just the names and faces of the people in the pews or the chairs next to us, we knew their stories and they knew ours. We knew what we cared about, what we worried about. And that allowed us to reimagine how our community could be transformed. So that's just one part of the story about how organizing gave us some of the tools we needed to reimagine our community.
Thanks, Lois. Yeah, I've got questions, but we gotta keep going for right now. So John, what would you say? What's something that comes to your mind about the impact of organizing?
So I want to talk a little bit about relational organizing and the transformation of a congregation. I've been a part of this community literally since I came to Portland, but associated through organizing, because in 1986, I was called to Vernon Presbyterian Church, which is right down the street from Redeemer. And at that time, I didn't even know didn't have a clue about community organizing. And one of the things that I really struggled with was, how do you do justice in an authentic way? I had come after 12 years of experience in urban Los Angeles, but I still didn't understand how to do justice. And so today, relational organizing is probably the most important tool, as far as I'm concerned, in putting your faith into action as an institution, as an individual. And it's the tool that really can transform institutions in the service of justice. So what I'd like to do is start out with a Vernon story that I will move into our relationship with Redeemer, and ultimately the transformation into Salt and Light. About a few weeks before I was called to Vernon Presbyterian Church in 1986, the Vernon leaders had decided to reach out to the community. And so they sent out teams of individuals to visit their neighbors. And they visited about 70 or 80 neighbors in the immediate area around Vernon Presbyterian Church. And they asked them questions about their concerns for the neighborhood. And then they went back to the church and decided what the neighborhood was saying was they're concerned about crime, so we need to do neighborhood watch. They went back to those same neighbors, told them about the meeting that they were going to have about neighborhood watch, and invited them to that meeting. It was that exact same time that I came to Vernon Presbyterian Church that week. And so I was there for that meeting. And I was there at that meeting with a representative from the city and 2 other church folks. And that was it, 4 people. Interestingly enough, the first visitor I had in my office when I came to Vernon was the lead organizer for POP that Solveig mentioned, the group of Eastside churches that were organizing to do justice work. And Kevin invited me to a pastor's meeting that week where I met Terry. He then came back to see me several times and we talked about organizing. I shared about the experience we had in the neighborhood. He came and he trained some of our leaders. And after a few months of those trainings and meetings with Kevin and other POP leaders, we did the exact same thing. We went out and visited the same neighbors, but the invitation was different. We didn't invite them to come to a meeting where we had decided what the answer was. We simply invited them to come and talk to their neighbors about their concerns. And Kevin facilitated that meeting and lifted up stories and concerns and asked all kinds of questions. And I forget what I mentioned. So for that meeting that we had, after all that work was done, we had close to 200 people showed up for that meeting. About 50% from the neighborhood and all Vernon members. So Kevin led that discussion, and what happened, and it was startling. People were concerned about crime, but that wasn't their issue. Their issue was they didn't know their neighbors, and so they didn't want to get involved in neighborhood watch because they weren't going to give their phone numbers away. And as they continued to talk, they said, you know, what we need in this neighborhood is a cleanup. We've got abandoned cars and abandoned homes, and we need to clean up and have a party and celebrate. So we planned a party instead. We had a neighborhood cleanup with city commissioners and a city commissioner, and publicity, drop boxes, balloons, barbecue. And then we had groups of people who came and just talked about where they would like to go from there. And out of that came about 4 action groups made up of neighbors and church members. One of those groups was Neighborhood Watch. One was dealing with children's issues. One was dealing with housing. And from that point on, that was the launch for us to get very, very heavily engaged in community organizing. And for me, it was like night and day between a church approach to we've got the answer, come and we'll help you, to, like Solveig said, in that relational meeting and in that discernment discussion, unleashing the imagination and the power. And we had developed a lot of trust, not only between neighbor and church, but also partnering churches like Redeemer, because we engaged in a lot of work together over several years. We too joined POP in 1987. And out of a relational meeting in 2000, the year 2000, we talked about our common interests and the need to do something different. And so then Vernon and Redeemer began on a journey of creating something new together. And it would have never happened had we not had the trust of those relationships that had formed over the years. I've been a part of a number of attempts of church merges and all kinds of things. They rarely, if ever, work because the relational work hasn't been done beforehand. And so I think, that's to me the power of relational organizing and the trust building you can have that, like Lois, I trust the leadership and the members in this community just because of the relationships I have with one another. And with that, I will shut my mouth.
So good. Thanks, John. Thanks, John. Yeah, Nancy, what do you add to this already rich story?
Well, thank you. I would say that for myself and the other leaders at Redeemer, the heart and the soul of organizing was held by this container that we called the core team. And the core team was a group of primary leaders inside Redeemer. We were trained leaders who'd been through local training institutes and in many cases, national 10-day leadership training, 10 days of training. We were affiliated, as Solveig's already talked about, with a well-established organizing network of the IAF, Industrial Areas Foundation, Saul Alinsky. Maybe you've heard the book Rules for Radicals. It's a couple of us now, this has been years ago. So people that maybe aren't even living, right, had an influence. But Redeemer as a congregation was a dues paying member of the Portland Organizing Project and later of the Metropolitan Alliance for Common Good. And it wasn't just the power of people, but it was the power of money. So with those dues dollars, Redeemer was making an investment of significant money into the development of our leadership. And my own introduction to organizing within faith communities was in the early 1990s. The possibility of building power great enough to affect real change was based on the recognition, and for me, that's the actual seeing and hearing of our collectively held stories. And it really changed my life forever because it was a whole new way of thinking of how to be church, how to be people of faith. And it held such great potential. And it happened inside those local training sessions where we sat in circles alongside leaders from a wide variety of faith communities, as well as leaders from schools and leaders from labor unions. It was an eye-opening time because we discovered that outside of the churches, there were also people struggling with the same issues that we were facing in a different institution. And so we discovered the power of stories. So Lois referred to that as well, Solveig, that, the change that occurs between the hearer and the teller. But we also discovered the story of power. And we learned that we could enter into direct negotiations, like with government and market entities, and that together we could make changes in the big picture. And it wasn't just theoretical. There was always action associated with the training, always something for us to actually be engaged in and learn from. But the nuts and bolts of it happened inside our own institution. And as the Redeemer core team, we listened to our stories, the stories that were rising up in the lives of all of our members. And we discovered common stories and common pressures. And then in reflection, we practiced. It was really a practice. We were like a place where we were practicing what we were learning. Practiced discovering the connections between our stories, and then noticing patterns within those stories. And I'll just say, it was very time consuming. It was like a relentless amount of time that we were spending. But what we were doing was spending a relentless amount of energy paying attention to our development as leaders. And that is, I think, really significant. So we began to find meaning and significance, and those core team meetings were a sacred space where our hearts and our minds yearned to create a new story for our families and our communities. We didn't know how we were going to do that, but we had this deep yearning for it. And then it was in those circles of leaders that the vision began to take shape. And it was a space where our imaginations could soar and we could find hope. And it came, as Lois and John have both said, out of the deepness of the relationships within the core teams, that we found courage and strength to imagine the creation of a new way of being. And, that led, with more and more and more of that, to the actual transformation of Redeemer to Leaven and Salt and Light. And in some ways, I hesitate to share the story that I have, but I'm going to do it anyway, that because it is an issue, organizing, but it was recommended, and I think it's a very clean story in some ways, very early on, not when we were trying to transform between Redeemer, the failing Redeemer, to the present, but it's about the sewer issue, and it was mentioned in Solveig's introduction. So my husband and I bought our home in Cully for $47,000 in 1978. We had previously lived on 19th Avenue right by the church. And one day in 1990, we received an assessment from the city of Portland, Bureau of Environmental Services, for $15,000. So, about a third of the value of our house. And that was to pay for a sewer pipe to go down the middle of Simpson Street to bring us sewer services. And the neighbors in Cully and Park Rose and Roseway and other East County neighborhoods all face this unaffordable high cost of sewer connections. Not everybody that's just moved to Portland recently knows that in 1990, we were the largest unsewered area in the country. It was like everything east of 42nd Avenue. So we found ourselves in the middle of a $1 billion EPA mandated project that impacted the lives of most of the East Multnomah County. And in each of those county neighborhoods, though, there were churches. And a number of those churches were members of POP. And so we found out that there were families in those congregations that were affected, and leaders from Redeemer and from St. Charles and St. Rita's and St. Peter's down in Southeast Portland, to just name a few. We gathered and began to strategize and seek relief for members who were facing these huge bills. I mean, elderly people that would be like my age now, we would have possibly lost our homes because we couldn't have possibly paid that increase. Now, the sewer campaign was a long marathon-like event. It was something like, I think, the pandemic. I was really thinking about that this morning, a lot like that, like this ever going to end. But together as the people of institutions, we negotiated with the city leaders over this multiple years campaign, and we secured $5 million in relief for homeowners who were living in our neighborhoods. These were our neighbors, our next door neighbors, our across the street. It was everybody. And that illustrated for us that we had, through our power among one another, we had power to speak to elected people who had to listen to us, and they had to respond. We didn't figure out the solution. We did not figure out the solution. We said, here is our situation. You have a responsibility to respond to us and come up with a plan. And the city did. So our ability to lead the campaign was entirely based on the relationships that we had built prior to the issue of the sewer assessment bills arriving in our house. Each person was a member of the congregation where organizing practices were integral to that culture. And while it was many years later, some years later, I guess it wasn't that many, but we began the intentional transformation of Redeemer into what is now Leaven and Salt and Light. It was the culture and the practices of organizing that were the foundation, and the relationships were, and I believe still are, the strength upon which we realized those possibilities for transformation.
Oh, wow. I'm really glad that you shared that sewer story, Nancy.
It's an old one.
Hold on, it's very fun.
But I haven't forgotten it.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I have so many questions. We need to move into breakout rooms. But in your breakout rooms, what are you feeling in response to these stories? What energy is being activated in you? And what are you curious about? What do you want to learn more about from these stories?